want to know how you designed me to live. But I feel like there's so much going on in my life. I have these questions, but I haven't taken the time to look for answers. I mean, I've heard these things before: holiness, grace, righteousness. But what do they really mean? How can I make them a part of my life? Can I really change?
All right, how are you guys doing, Sanctuary? Ah, nice. You guys are awake. I was afraid we were gonna come home and everybody's gonna be sleepy because of the retreat, but that just woke me up. So thank you for doing that. I'm Pauline. I've been staff here at Black Rock for a little while, but I've been part of the Sanctuary family since 2012. So I love to be up here and to talk to us, because even though we were away and we had a lot of fun, I missed you guys. I know that half of us went. Can you raise your hand if you went to the retreat this weekend? All right, make some noise too. If you went to the retreat, awesome, cool. Now, if you didn't go to the retreat, if there was somebody next to you who didn't go, turn to them and say, you missed out. Go ahead, tell them you missed out. But now go ahead and tell them that God has something special for them tonight. Say, God has something special for you tonight. Okay, I don't think you guys believe that, so I'm going to say that to you. God has something special for you tonight. Do you believe that? All right, cool. So, as you guys saw by the introduction video, we've been in this series, and now this is week 4 of the Rediscover series. So Rob talked a little bit about it last weekend, but if you weren't here, I want to let you know that we came to this because we were trying to figure out, what are we going to talk about? The teaching team, we sat there and we're like, man, God has something, but we don't know what it is. We're going to try to figure this out. And we just all kept thinking about these words that we hear growing up. And if you've been in the church for a long time, like I have, you probably heard all those words a billion times, but you don't necessarily know what they really mean. So for me, it was the same way. And Rob said it, when we were deciding to preach and what we were preaching on, he jumped on worship because that was his passion, and Treadwell jumped on grace because that was his passion to talk about, and holiness was like, oh, who's going to talk about that? But righteousness was kind of in the same vein, but it happened to be something that God was speaking to me about. So I wanted to jump on the bandwagon because it's a lot easier when God's speaking to us for us to then preach a sermon for us first and then try to preach to y'all, because it's not easy to preach a sermon that you can't live yourself. So tonight I'm going to be really vulnerable, and that's what I usually try to be with you guys. So if I'm talking about something here, don't think that that's not something that I'm telling myself first. So for most of it, I'm going to say we, or if I say you, don't think that excludes me from that message, all right? Cool. So when we think about righteousness, and when I thought about righteousness, I must confess that it was similar to the word holiness. And when you hear it, like the cringe factor is like, are we going to talk about righteousness? Like, what does that really mean? And in the church, it's just like, so-and-so is a righteous brother, or she's a righteous sister. And I'm like, that makes no sense. I have no idea what that means. But when I thought of righteousness, I thought of it along the lines of this video. So watch it with me.
How could you draw everything else? I'm worthy, but I God, not burdened with glorious thirst. Worthy, but a sword. We have no quarrels of you. And that has a quarrel with root. You break the stones, I come with glad tidings. The world may free.
Yeah, I thought of like, I am burdened with glorious purpose. Like when you think about righteousness, that's what the people thought about it, like you just walk with your head up here and as if you have everything figured out. And righteousness, sometimes we think of it and it's like that person who's got it all ready. Maybe it's like your 8th grade, person that you didn't like, that person that was trying really hard to get the teacher's attention and get an A+ on everything, or that person in your Sunday school class that always raised their hands, or as we got older, it was that person that seemed like they never tripped, they never sinned, and their life was just amazing and perfect, and they never had to struggle with anything. Was I the only one who was thinking about that before, or have you guys thought about that too? Yeah, so what I want to do tonight is really change our perspective of what the word righteousness means and show you guys that it's not necessarily exhibited in the way that we watched, but it's a little bit different, and in fact is a lot different than what we thought. So I'm a word person. I think a lot of us who speak up here, we end up being like word nerds, and you know what? I'm being a nerd is cool now, so I'm fine with it. But I love to look up definitions of things and figure out what it is. So when we think about righteousness and we think about the definition of it, our thoughts is Loki. He is burdened with glorious purpose. He never trips. He should rule the world, and sometimes we think about ourselves that way too, but the actual definition of righteousness is acting in accord with divine moral law, being free of guilt and sin. Or if you want to think about it this way too, by the Webster definition, is the quality of being morally right or justifiable. And that's what we think about that definition, and that's what it puts. So if we're thinking about being righteous in that sense, being righteous in that sense, in being divine, with acting in divine moral law, there's only one place that we can think about what divine moral law is, and we can't really look at it outside of what's divine. So the only way that we're going to truly figure out what righteousness is if we actually look at what the only thing that's divine that I know about, which is God, and what that really means. So if we look at righteousness in the context of the Bible, the synonym for the word righteousness that there too is justice. But the kicker is that righteousness, if you look anywhere in the Bible, is just God. Like, he is the divine, therefore his actions establish righteousness. Outside of that, it's not righteousness. It's doing, and we can find some other definition for it. Maybe it's like trying to do what is right, but he is the one who sets the standard for what is just, for what is justice, and for what righteousness really means. Now, before, I'm going to press pause, just put a pin on that. When we were talking about in the past few weeks about holiness, Rob mentioned that God is holy because he's set apart, right? There is no other like him, and he is the only one who is like that. And in that definition too, he is the only one who is perfect. He's never sinned. He never will sin. Therefore, if we're thinking about that too, if righteousness is being free of guilt and sin, the only one who is free of guilt and sin by its matter of being is God himself. Does that make sense to you guys? I know that's a little bit of like a theological wording, but I know a lot of you like that type of thing. So I put it that explanation in that way. But A.W. Tozer, who we heard from in Rob's message, and I think maybe Treadwell mentioned him too, he's amazing. Go read The Attributes of God. All of us have mentioned it up here. It's great. Just read it. But he puts it this way. Justice, when used of God, or when it's talking about God, is a name we give to the way God is, nothing more. And when God acts justly, he is not doing so to conform to any independent criterion, but simply acting like himself in a given situation. God is his own self-existence principle of moral equity, and when he sentences evil men or rewards the righteous, he simply acts like himself from within, uninfluenced by anything that is not himself. So I know that was a lot of words, but all that means is that God is the one who sets the standard for what is morally right. And God is the one who's the only one who's free of sin and free of guilt. Therefore, he is the righteousness. And when we're trying to figure out, as the video said, what do these words mean and how do we apply that to our lives, if we look anywhere outside of God, we're going to get an incomplete picture of what righteousness really is. You guys got that? All right. So that's great. We're like, okay, God is righteousness. Awesome. We got that the same way that we say God is love and he's peace. And as you get to know him, you get to know his character and you get to know what that looks like in the way that he acts towards you. But then you must ask, and I don't know if you do this, but whenever I hear that, I try to understand it in relation to myself. So I'm like, if God is righteousness, what does that mean about me? And honestly, for me, this was a little discouraging at first, because if he's righteousness and he's free of sin, I am not free of sin. Therefore, one, I'm not righteousness, and two, I am not righteous. Because I can try as hard as I can to do what is right, to be better than other people, but I'm never going to reach that standard that God is, that he set for me on my own. I can try hard, and believe me, I'm a hard worker, and I believe you guys are hard workers too, and if you set your mind to something, you're going to achieve it, but you're going to be running a tiring race, because I don't know about you guys, but when you set that sight of perfection, think about that 8th grade person or that person in your church, and I hope you're not looking around and thinking that they are in here, but that person in your church that has everything figured out, and that their life is perfect, and their hair always like they wake up flawless. That person has not reached the standard that God has set for righteousness. No one in this room has. And that's kind of, saddening when you read it. And even in the Psalms, when I was doing this, there was one part in Psalm 14 that says, no one is righteous, no, not one. It is as if the writer is like, yeah, I know you're like, no one. And he's like, no one. No one is righteous, not one understand, no one seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. You're like, oh man, like that hurt. But I'm a good person. I try, I pay my taxes. I brush my teeth 3 times a day. I try to be nice to my neighbor. And still, you're not reaching that standard, because if you go back to the messages and we were talking about in a few weeks about grace, none of us are really perfect, and none of us can live as if we never needed grace in our lives. How many of you were here for when we talked about grace a couple weeks ago? So that should make sense to you, that all of us need grace and none of us are beyond it. And I'm going to talk about how that still connects. But that's the reality of living in a fallen world, living in a world where people have sinned, and we sin every day. Am I the only sinner in the room? No, I'm not. And if you think you're not a sinner, I guess that's your first sin. That you're not beyond that. All of us here are sinners. All of us are on the same level. And if you read Romans 3:23, it says again that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if you've been in church for a while, you probably have heard that a lot. And you're like, yeah, all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What does that really mean? That just means, and the New Living Translation, I know a few of you in here like it, talks about, for all of us have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious standard. And when I read it in that translation, which is important for you guys if you're doing Bible study, this is a freebie. Try to read different translations so that you understand it a little bit differently. If you're thinking about it and that we've fallen short of God's glorious standard, what's that standard? What's his standard? And what did I just tell you guys is his standard? Right. So therefore, none of us are righteous. And that's saddening. But the best part is that, thank God, all pun intended, it doesn't end there. That because of God, yes, we are not righteous. Not one of us is righteous. I'm not righteous. Far from being righteous. Is that without Jesus, none of us are righteous. But with Jesus, all of us are righteous. I'm going to say that again because I don't think you guys understand that. Without Jesus, none of us are righteous, but with Jesus, all of us are righteous. All right. I want you guys to start catching a little bit of this, because when I heard about it, it made my heart glad. For being with Jesus, we can be not only have grace and be with God, but we can be called righteous again. I don't need to feel like, oh my gosh, I have this standard that's set for me that I'm never going to achieve. With Jesus, we can reach that standard. We can reach the standard of not only doing what's right, but being in right living. And I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about that in a little bit. But Romans 5:21 is up there, and I apparently just lost it in my notes, so bear with me. You know what? I'll just sit around and read it with you. So, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So before, God used to be the only one who was righteous, the only one who could achieve that standard. But in him, it says right there, in him, we become the righteousness of God. Because of Jesus, God looks at us in a completely different way when before we were sinners, and apart from him, when our relationship had been severed because we were sinning, and if he is free of sin, and he is just, remember, righteousness is also justice, and he's going to act in accordance with that, he couldn't be in relationship with us because he's not going to be calling you part of his family to be like him if you aren't sharing in what he has. So if you weren't sharing who God is, and again, without Jesus, we'll never be like him, you are apart from God. But when you are in Jesus, you are in relationship with God, and you have access to all that he is and all that he has, including his righteousness. And not only that, we become the righteousness of God. We become what he looks at and says, that is totally, completely right and perfect. For us to look at ourselves, I know that for me, I don't always look at myself and say, this is totally right and perfect. There are some days that I don't wake up flawless, and Beyonce doesn't either, just letting you guys know. Nobody does. But it's not only in that and looking at myself physically, but let's be honest, there are times in our lives in which we take some actions that are less than perfect. I don't know about you guys, I tend to have a little bit of road rage. So that becomes very, very clear when we're driving and somebody cuts me off and I'm like, oh, you're a child of God, and I hope you have a safe trip, because you got to learn how to drive, man. But that's just making fun of something light. But there are other sins in our lives that aren't as funny. When we are dealing with thoughts that we shouldn't be having, whether it's of lust or pride or insecurity, or when we're dealing with an issue of even, not even honoring people in the way that we treat them, in the way that we speak with them. When you grow up with a family in the retreat, we had the great opportunity to hear from one of our leaders, and she talked about her experience with her parents growing up, and specifically her relationship with her father, and having a relationship that was both verbally and physically abusive. And for years, she struggled to forgive that person. That's being less than perfect. And you know what? Not being able to forgive that person is not the way that we're supposed to live either. So it is when you decide to pay somebody with the same actions that they repay you, that could be considered sin too. It's not just, hey, I'm struggling, and we always talk about the big ones. We're struggling with lust. Yes, it is still a sin, but unforgiveness is a sin too. So all of us in our lives have different types of sins that we cannot, on our own, get over it. And that's where grace comes in. And I'm not going to re-preach the message that Treadwell preached before, but that's where grace comes in. That's where Jesus comes in our lives, where I cannot do this on my own because I have sinned, and I sin every day, and I try not to, and I sin again, and I try not to, and I sin again, and you guys get how it goes. We have fallen short of God's glorious standard. And because of grace, we are able to go back to him. We're able to live in the way and in the relationship that God has desired for us to live. So if you turn with me to Romans 3:21 through 26, and it's going to be on the screen too. But this chapter, a lot of us have heard of it before, but I don't think I had even noticed how much the word righteousness is in there. And it says, have you guys found it? Because I want to okay, cool. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that's the one we know, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. Remember, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, when we read a lot of those, we talked about in the context of grace as being a gift. But we don't always talk about in the context of God as being righteous, fully just, and acting out his righteousness and justice. Because without grace, again, because we're sinners, we severed that relationship with God. He wasn't his full right to cast us aside. He wasn't his full right to say, this person is no longer part of my family, or was never part of my family. They never chose me. Although I created them in my image, they've rejected me, and they want nothing to do with me. And that would have been his right to just say, they sinned, and the repayment for sin is death and separation from me, which is the ultimate death, right? If we're separate from God and from him in eternity, that's the ultimate death. It's not just this physical death that we're going to stop living. I hope I'm going to die at 103. I'm going to live a lot. It's not just that death. It's the eternal death that will never be in relationship with God, and that's the worst of all. But because of Jesus, he says, I'm going to send my son, and that's where grace comes in. I'm going to send my son. He's going to die, and he's going to extend grace. They did nothing to receive this. It's a gift. And instead, he's going to pay for their sins. And now they can be in relationship with me again. So because of Jesus, and that's the word, justifiable, one of the definitions of righteousness is justifiable, or in the context of the Bible, is justified. Because of Jesus, we're justified. So what we were supposed to be paid, which was with our own life, Jesus paid with his life, so that now we could be called justified or righteous. Do you guys follow that? I think I kind of said it a little too fast. So because of Jesus and his sacrifice of grace, when we believe in Jesus and what he did for us through faith, we're called justified, as in our debt has been repaid. We no longer need to pay things with our lives because Jesus did. And because of that, if we go back to Romans 5:21, we can be called the righteousness of God. We can be back in his life and back in relationship with him. So righteousness is not just being I'm pompous and I'm going to show people what my life is like, and I'm going to show people that I'm doing everything right. It means I've been made right by God so that I could live with him again. So if you're somebody who's righteous, you're not somebody who gets everything right all the time. You're somebody who's been made right for all eternity. So I want to make sure that you guys get that you've been made right for all eternity. Do you get it? But that doesn't end there either. They mentioned that we've all fallen off of the glorious standard of God, and then through grace, we're back in that standard. We can be made and seen perfect and made right again. But righteousness requires of us a response too, made by faith, where we hear this, and I think we've said this here several times. We say, come as you are, but don't stay as you are. And then you're like, what does that even mean? Again, come as you are, don't stay as you are. The come as you are part is grace. And then don't stay as you are is your response to it. Is your righteousness being shown. I've been made right, and I'm not going to be pompous about it and say I have all the right, because, you weren't made right on your own. You were made right by Jesus, so you didn't earn that. You didn't work that out. But you're going to say, hey, I'm going to show with my life what that looks like. I'm not going to stay as I am, because I've been given something that was a great gift, and I want to live that out. Now, for me, what that looked like, one of the ways that I thought about telling you guys about it was that I, for example, went to college to Fairfield U. Any Fairfield U students here? Woo! Yeah, go Stags. I went to Fairfield U, graduated in 2014, but I went on scholarship. I didn't have, and there's no shame in this, I told you guys I was going to be vulnerable. My parents couldn't pay for me to attend a school that at the time was going to be $55,000 a year. It was just not something that I grew up expecting that, and there's nothing wrong if you did. But my reality was different, that I knew that I wanted to go to college, and I wanted to achieve this certain standard of living, and I wanted to have a diploma, but I knew that I could not make it happen. Instead, I was blessed, thank God, and I thank Him every day, by a family who decided to pay for my schooling in the form of a merit scholarship. Now, I went to school on pretty much a full ride to Fairview Due because somebody who had something to pay for me to do that. Now, that was great. That would have been what? Grace. I didn't necessarily deserve it, but they paid for me. But my response to that was to say, hey, somebody is deciding to put $200,000 into my life. I'm going to do my best while I'm there. I'm going to take advantage of the favor that was placed upon my life so that I can do the best that I can to not only just go to school, but I want to make honors, and I want to take advantage of all the programs that are there. I want to make lifelong friends. I want to make connections with alumni and take advantage of the network. If they have a Broadway show, I'm going to that, the eagerness of your heart in that is beautiful. I knew that there was nothing that I was going to do to change the fact that they pay for me. So that I got as a gift, but my response and what I did while I was there was my decision. So the same way it is when we receive God. Like when we receive the gift of grace, when we come and Jesus accepts us as we are, He funds our life for us, we then have a response to say, I'm going to live the best way that I can. Not because I'm going to earn this gift, because it's already been given to me, but I'm going to show that I appreciate this gift. And I want others to know the difference it's making in my life. Does that make sense? So, you guys are awesome. I'm so glad you're with me. So when it comes to righteousness, it's not just the fact that you've been made right, but that you choose to live in an upright way. You need to choose to live that in your life. So in Ephesians 4, which has become one of my favorite books in the past few weeks. So if you haven't read it, it's only 6 chapters, read it. It says in Ephesians 4, 17 through 24. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life that you learned when you heard about Jesus Christ and were taught in Him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught, with regard to your former life, put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in the true righteousness and holiness. So, even in here, and this is Paul, and I love him. I love that I'm named after him, because he doesn't hold back, He's like, listen, you know about Jesus, you know about Him and what He calls you to do, so start living like it. And it's not easy to hear it if you think I'm going to do this on my own, if you think all of a sudden I'm going to have to change all these things that I do, and all of a sudden you start falling under that burden again that I'm going to work this out myself, that I'm going to live to that standard on my own. But I don't want you to forget that you're not going to live in that standard on your own. You can only live that standard with Jesus. So when it comes to changing your life, when it comes to living like the righteousness that He has for you, we tend to cringe, because then we go back to I'm going to work this again, and I'm going to end up being like Loki. I'm going to end up walking around showing everybody that I'm better than you. And if that's what your righteousness is going to look like, you need to go back and understand how you got it. But if it's not going to look like that, it's going to look like something completely different. It's going to look like you extending grace the same way that you were extended grace. It's going to look like you forgiving the people that have hurt you the same way that you were forgiven. It's going to look like when somebody cuts you off in traffic, you're not going to need to, hold on and be like, oh, you're just going to say, you know what? Go ahead. This was better that you go before me so I don't get into a car accident that's going to derail me, and I'm not going to go after you because, then I'm going to be causing the accident, and my insurance premium is going to go up, and then I'm going to have to explain to people. So you no longer have to think about those things because the attitude of your heart, the posture of your life has changed. So when those things come to you and try to derail you, you're like, yo, I see you, and that's not how I live, so I'm not going to go down this path. So, yeah, that's why we're all going to do this together. Because I want to caution us again that if we don't do that, if we don't react to our righteousness and upright living out of a place of loving God and understanding the gift that He has given us, we go back to living under the law. And that only means legalism, and that really means I'm going to follow these do's and don'ts on my own, and I'm going to forget that I walk in them with Jesus and because of Jesus. On your own, trying to just follow the do's and don'ts of the Bible, I'm going to tell you right now, it's really tiring. Because I've been tired of doing that for a lot of my life. And if you grew up in church, that's one of the ways that we sometimes tend to sin the worst. Not that one sin is greater than the other, but that's something that we trip up in because we're taught a lot of the do's and don'ts. And we think that if we do those do's and we don't do the don'ts, we're going to be good. That we have earned the right to be called a good person or a righteous person. And you are never, ever going to earn your righteousness. Because you know what? Also, if you're called righteous because of your own actions and only because of that, when you are not living upright, then you would be stopped being called righteous. You would no longer be righteous when you're sinning. You would no longer be righteous when you're cutting people off in traffic. But God says that even in those moments, even when you fall short again, you've been called righteous and made right for the rest of eternity. So lean on that instead. And, I could tell you and keep telling you what that looks like. And we try, when we preach a sermon, to always give you something practical. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you, do this or don't do that. Instead, you can always just go back to chapter 4. And after 17, that whole section is really called chapter 4 of Ephesians, in case you guys are taking notes. That is called the standard of Christian living, or the new life, or depending what you're talking about, the Christian life. And if you want practical steps, go read that section, and it says a lot about do this and don't do that. Forgive, be kind-hearted, go after God. It will give you, and we can sit down and write them together, and it would have been 3 slides of just bullet points of what it tells you to do. So go back and read there. But I'm somebody who doesn't just live in the do's and don'ts, even though I'm very practical. I need to understand the why. And I can tell you here 1,000 times, live out your righteousness and be upright, and this is what you do until I'm blue in the face, and you guys are going to be falling asleep. 1, because you came back from retreat and you're tired, and 2, because I'm going to bore you to death. But instead, I need to tell you why living uprightly and allowing righteousness to become something that you show in your life really changes you. And the band, I know I'm almost over, but if you guys want to start coming up, you can. I'm going to tell you why we live in righteousness and why we choose righteousness to not only be part of God's identity, but be part of our identity. And that is because righteousness protects our hearts. I told you guys that Ephesians has become one of my favorite books right now. And in Ephesians 6 is one of my favorite passages. And it's, I put my Bible up here. And it's one of my favorite passages because when Paul is closing that letter, and I'm bringing it up because I need to show you guys how much I've been on it lately. It's fully marked up. And he talks in verse 14 about the armor of God. And when I was studying, this just happened to really hit my heart and speak to me. And in verse 14 it says, "Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace." But in verse 13, right before that, it says, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all to stand firm, stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and put on the breastplate of righteousness." And when I thought about that, I said, why, of all the things that Paul could have used to describe a breastplate, why did he say righteousness? And when I thought about it, and being in a place where he's talking about spiritual warfare and talking about the fact that all that really means is that we live a life where the enemy is going to try to attack us and derail us. He's going to try to trip us, and he's going to try to send cars to cut us off in traffic, right? So what he's going to do is try to really get you to trip up and forget what you're doing and forget your righteousness. And armors are not meant for fashion. I know that nowadays we use a lot of things that are out of combat, like combat boots and panels over here that look like breastplates, but they aren't necessarily. They aren't for fashion. Breastplates are used in combat because they're for protection. So, and if you're talking about a breastplate is a metal part that would cover the front and sometimes go around your body so that all your vital organs are being protected, and specifically your heart being protected, because your heart is one of the biggest muscles and the one that makes sure that the rest of your body continues to receive blood and continues to live. If for some reason your heart stops pumping blood, everything else stops working. Even if your brain is working, if your heart stops, you might still die. So, the breastplate was meant to protect the heart so that when there was a blow and something came to get you, it would just bounce right off of you. And so that your heart wouldn't be in danger, that nothing that could kill you would pierce your breastplate and end up stopping what you were doing and end up stopping you from achieving that victory, from winning that battle, from winning the overall war. So what our physical heart is to our bodies, our spiritual hearts is to us as well. Our hearts, and I think Chantel was speaking this morning during the Q&A, and if you guys weren't there, I'm going to give you this because it was really cool. Our heart is one of the places in our body that houses our feelings, right? And it houses some theologians say, it might even house your spirit. And it's your soul, what expresses what you are to God. And so the breastplate of righteousness, living uprightly and knowing that you've been made right, protects the relationship that you have with God. It protects your spirit and the way that you express it. So in Proverbs 4:23, it talks about, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. So if that's your spiritual heart and you're living your walk with Jesus, everything you do in your walk with Jesus flows out of your heart. Everything you're trying to do in your life, whether it's physically or everything you're trying to achieve as you're growing, everything you're trying to change flows from your heart. And if you leave your heart unprotected, you're never going to get there. So when you choose to live upright, when you do the practical things that are in Ephesians 4, and that's instructions for Christian living. So stop asking me, what do I do when we accept Jesus? Go read that and start doing that. It's a good place to start. Stop asking Rob that too. I mean, we love you guys. We want to walk with you in that. But read those things, put them in practice, because what they do is make sure that your relationship with God is protected. That your heart and your dreams and everything that's in there is protected. How many of you have suffered heartbreak here before? I'm not just talking about romantic heartbreak. I'm talking about dreams that you had before that you held so close to you. And we always go like this because they're housed in here in your heart, right? And all of a sudden that didn't happen and your heart was broken. And that was one of the worst feelings you've ever had. Now, if your soul is in your heart, and your spirit is in there, and the things that you're dreaming in God get thwarted, that's going to hurt just as much, if not more. So we want you, and I'm saying, I preach this to myself first, guys. Start putting righteousness and make that a part of your identity. Work that out. Declare that over yourself. Because out of that, not only are you going to see you going forward and into the things that God has for you, but other people are going to see it too. Because I've said I'm a nerd and I like things, and I already talked about one superhero, a villain. Wow, so now I have to talk about a superhero. And when we talk about breastplates, maybe in armor, like Roman armor, you think of it metal, but if you're talking about it in terms of Captain America or Superman, and I think I have a picture up there, when you're talking about the breastplate, it's right in front of their chest, right? It's like what protects them. But one thing that really struck me is that right on that breastplate, for both of them and for a lot of other guys, I know Batman wasn't up there, sorry, I don't really like him very much. So he also has the bat symbol up there, and that shows who they are and their identity. So if you're the righteousness of God and that's your identity, what you're gonna wear right in front of you is that. It's gonna show that I'm a child of God, I've been made right by Him, and I live in that way. So I'm gonna ask you guys tonight, if that's your breastplate, whose righteousness are you wearing? Are you wearing your own righteousness, or are you wearing the righteousness of God? And again, this is not something to convict you and to make you feel bad. I already told you that you're made right and you're not doing this on your own. You're doing it with God and you're wearing His righteousness, so be proud of it. Be proud that you have been changed and you have been called a child of God, and you will forever be called a child of God. So when in those moments when you take a blow, when Captain America is fighting Iron Man or fighting whoever and they're on the floor and you're like, dang, like they lost, they're defeated, their breastplate is still intact. They're still protected. That hasn't changed. Captain America's shield has broken, and that if it's the shield of faith, sometimes our faith, gets a little chink in there, but that's another message for another time. His breastplate was still the same. So your breastplate is still intact, even in the moments when you fail. Even in the moments when you think you can't get up again, you can, because what gives you life, where life flows from within, which is your heart, is still protected. So as the band is up here, I want to pray for you and pray with you, really, because that's for my life too. And let's really reflect on that question: whose righteousness are we wearing? So God, we come before you tonight, and we really ask that you would be with us, that we'd have a revelation of your righteousness, a revelation that we're not doing this on our own, that we can't do anything to earn it, but that we've been made right with you because of you for the rest of eternity. So God, if there is any area in our lives which we're struggling to see that come true, to see that identity come forth, I pray, Jesus, that you give us a revelation and give us the strength to live it out. Lord, I know that we may not be perfect and we're not going to get it right in the first time, but that's not what this is all about. It's about the fact that we've been made right with you, and that we're going to live that out, and we're going to try to live that out until the day that we die, because we're acknowledging the gift that you have given us. And we're living in the best that we can, knowing that your grace is always covering us, and knowing that we have so much in you because we are part of who you are, and we have been, Lord, in your presence and with you, and there's nothing better than to be in there, Lord. So I ask, Jesus, that we begin to wear your righteousness, that we begin to know who we are in you, and that we would choose and decide out of the love that we have for you to live in that way as well. So Lord, I just pray against any lies of the enemy that addiction is forever going to keep us down, or that lust is forever going to keep us down, or that unforgiveness is never going to let us be in the standard of life that God wants us to live. God, I want to come against the lie that we, again, are doing this on our own. We're not. We're doing it with you and because of you. So if there's any area in our life, any lie that we're believing that keeps us from you right now, it's defeated. And we declare in the name of Jesus that we are righteous, that we have been made right for the rest of our lives. And we are proud of it, and we're going to wear that on our chest forever and ever. We praise you and we worship you. Amen.